Welcome to episode 25 of our look at the Psalms together. If you recall, last episode we began looking at this wonderful Psalm 23, and unlike previous weeks where I've kind of almost dealt with a whole psalm in a single week, this is a bit more different, and I've decided that what I'd like to do is take a little more time in looking at this momentous psalm because there's really so much in it. And it's typically a psalm that even those who have a very, very basic knowledge of the Psalms will have known and heard of Psalm 23. Even people who perhaps don't even go to church at all will be semi-familiar with some parts of this psalm. But in this episode, rather than the first verse which we looked at last week, I want to continue and look at this second verse. And it reads simply like this: He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. Now, straight from the top, it's a little misleading because you can't make a sheep lie down, as the passage seems to suggest. In fact, interestingly enough, when you look into it, do you know most sheep will only lay down if they're fed, well watered, and particularly safe, not threatened from things like bugs, wild animals, moving objects approaching them, some kind of whatever violent noise. It's only then, when they have all these things combined, that they lay down of their own instinctive accord. Something in them tells them when they're at peace. You can't make that happen. You can't call that time. You can't manipulate or manufacture that. It's an instinctive, a guttural thing in a sheep. This is what those who kind of worked in that area will tell me. And so when you consider a sheep laying down and being in a place of contentment, you appreciate that any sound, even as innocuous as perhaps a barking dog or some kind of can being kicked somewhere or some background noise, even that would be enough to unsettle a sheep and to cause it perhaps to lay down, but with an incredible degree of nervous tension. And it's only when those things are absent that it can truly lay down, when it's rid of a sensed anxiety, when it's lost that nervousness or that sense of insecurity. Only then will it lay down, because any of that kind of noise would forbid a sheep from being contented. Now, you've got to hold that picture in mind when you look at this verse, because it says, He makes me lie down. What he's talking about, David, is an extremely intimate sense of peace and tranquility. For a sheep to truly lay down means that it's rid of all potential anxiety and threat. Where I go running often in the week is a field where the sheep tend to rest by coming right up to near the road, the fence near the road, and leaning against the fence. And you'll sometimes see them as you begin to run up the road, just up ahead of you. You can see them all kind of clustered together near the... And the interesting thing is, as soon as I get anywhere near eyesight or that road, you can see one or two of them starting to unsettle. And once one or two unsettle, the others then perceive that there's a problem somewhere, so they get unsettled. And then the others then quickly catch that. And before you know it, a whole group of them are moving away long before you even get there. Why? Because they're not moving particularly for danger. They're moving for perceived danger. Isn't that reminiscent of our human condition? Sometimes we don't worry at what is actually happening. We worry at what might happen. It's the perceived danger, the perceived threat, the perceived anxiety that actually sends us in a bit of a spin. Sometimes our fears eat away at us, not because of what's actually happening to us, but with what we fear could happen to us, the potential consequences or difficulties that could come. And this is where we're beginning to touch on what this psalm is driving to. The actual wording is, He settles me down, as opposed to He makes me lie down. It's He settles me down. That means it's the shepherd's initiative, it's the shepherd's instinct, knowing his sheep, to bring them to a place of maximum tranquility and peace. And that is what this is talking about. This calm, this rest, if you like, which is an incredibly important word in this frenetic and time-pressured, high-demand society that we live in, where we are all overly familiar with fear and anxiety and nervous tension and depression. insecurities, all them things are become part of the rhetoric we use daily in our lives because we're all so familiar with it. In fact, when people talk about peace and tranquility, we have that kind of as if moment. What would I give for that? But David's saying that God knows the sheep so much that he takes the initiative to provide a tranquil place of peace, a place of removing those potential anxieties, if you like. He uses the term green pastures. It's an interesting term, isn't it? It's more interesting because actually, having read Kenneth Bailey's book, he actually says that he spent about 30 years in and around Israel, passed through a lot of seasons. He tells us in the book that the green pastures are a highly prized commodity, particularly among shepherds there, because they're only actually available about 2 to 3 months of the year. The rest of the year, there's some 9 or 10 months of it. He said most of the land is pretty brown and barren looking, really. And this meant that the local experienced shepherds, if you like, who lead their sheep daily out of the village to graze in the wilderness and whatever, and invariably they need to be pretty creative at certain parts of the year to find suitable foliage and suitable kind of feeding places for the sheep because they're so rarely found. And he's witnessed, he said, even in his time there, some shepherds as high up as Jabal Sanin, which apparently is a mountain that's 8,500 feet high. He said he's witnessed people near the top of that. Such was their creative effort and intent and determination to find suitable pasture for their sheep because, as I said, green pasture is not something you find all over the common land, if you like. So in other words, his point is this: a local shepherd in that area had to be extremely intent, carefully planning, very determined in order to find suitable pasture for his sheep. Shepherds had to sit down and plan their days efficiently and effectively if they were going to find suitable pasture, suitable food for their sheep during that day. And more than that, not just the pasture, but what they also had to find was possibly some water nearby that would correctly feed them. Green pastures, if you like, for a shepherd. Well, that was pretty much utopia. And for the sheep, it was like a 5-star hotel treatment. Very hard to find. And it wasn't up to the sheep to find them. The shepherd's role was to plan out the landscape and to find that. Now, you've got to hold all these wonderful thoughts in mind, you see, because as I'm saying this, you're beginning to get the idea of what it means when we say the Lord is my shepherd. Because God is finding the instinct. It's grace that however dry we are, he will find us a place that we can be restored and replenished. However hard, however barren, however fruitless a place, when just the ground is brown and barren and dying, if you like, it's grace that moves out of its way to find us green pastures, sometimes taking us to heights that we normally would be quite anxious about and insecure over, and sometimes to depths that we would fear. But inevitably, God finds the green pasture where we would not anticipate it being. And this is part of the great message. Places, if you like, moments, opportunities God uses to revive and replenish, to restore and to strengthen us, that without which we really would be in an absolute mess. And so David's call is this: he leads me beside still waters. That's a world of difference, being led, being driven. I'm sure most of us have got the image of a sheep being driven, or a herd of sheep being driven. My wife's family, they're from farming stock over many generations. They don't do as much now, but they certainly have over the years. And I can still remember when we first got together and first got married, going up there and seeing the farm, seeing the guys there in the quad bikes circling the sheep to try and move them from one area to another. Or you get the more traditional picture of the sheepdog and the shepherd, and the dogs kind of circling around the pack of sheep to move them in a certain direction. And it all speaks of being driven. You know, that's not being led, if you like. That's more of a picture that we understand in this society, in this culture, of how we move sheep around. But in the Middle East, it was very different. In fact, Kenneth Bailey provides what I always think is a really wonderful picture of it, because he says in there that in the wilderness of the Holy Land, open wilderness as it was, the shepherd would often walk slowly out ahead of his sheep. So he's not got his dogs circling the back to move them forward, or quad bikes running around, but he just simply walks forward. And witnessed by Bailey, he said, I've seen them play a 10-second tune on a pipe as they lead forward. Or more specifically, he said actually more often, every shepherd would have his unique call that amazingly a sheep would identify as their own. And by simply walking on ahead, playing a tune, call, these sheep would know exactly what is happening, and they would move forward with the shepherd. I think that's a fabulous image, don't you think? The shepherd singing his way forward and leading his sheep with him. That call, that heart of the shepherd, where the sheep are moving at their own pace. This is the important thing. When you're driving someone, you've got a dog yelping at the back or a quad bike circling you, you tend to get a jig on, don't you? You tend to move at a pace that even perhaps you're not comfortable with. You're crashing into it. Have you ever seen a pile of sheep being moved quickly from a field? They're banging into each other. They're squashing into each other. They're trying to root their way through the pack, fearing that if they get to the end of the pack, they might be the one the dog snaps or the bike hits. And so they're all kind of just looking incredibly agitating and uncomfortable until they're in the place they should be, and the bike disappears and the dogs go, and then they just breathe and they can stand for a moment. That's what being driven is like. You're never quite at peace. You're never quite sure of where you're going. And there's always agitation and difficulty and anxiety until you get a breather. But being led is different. The shepherd goes on ahead. He calls the sheep forward through his tune, his song, his call. And at their own pace, they are moving. More of the sheep, none of the sheep are feeling harassed. There's none of this jostling around, moving each other, keeping up with the pack kind of thing. Watch out, here comes the bike, here comes the dog yelping. None of them are apparently anxious. They're all moving at a wonderful pace. They're not worried they're going to get forgotten, left behind, trampled on. They've no need to feel that they've got to prove their efficiency. You know, whatever we associate with moving sheep, I think there's a lot of analogies with life. When you are being driven, there's a sense in which you have to impress, keep up with the Joneses, make sure that you don't fall behind, make sure you do your part, make sure that you have all your cards in a row, if you like. There is a world of difference between being driven and being led. Being led is pleasing. Being driven, it's pressure, isn't it? Being led is enjoyable, actually, but being driven, it's more of an endurance, making sure that you put your foot in the right place, you keep up with the crowd, you don't lag behind, you do what you're supposed to be doing. Being led, more importantly, is an intimate thing. It's a very personal feeling, a connecting thing. Being driven is, well, it's intimidating. You have to perform, you have to jump through hoops. And so David has this lovely line, he leads me beside still waters. So the whole idea of being led is that God is finding us resource. He's leading us in grace. He's being creative in finding us places to replenish and restore. But this lovely line, he leads me beside still waters. Let me come back to something I said before about when a shepherd looks for the utopia, which is green pastures, but also, if he can, ideally, water with it. But here's the interesting thing. I didn't know this, but I was reading through Bailey's notes, and he actually said that sheep will not drink from moving water. Now that may sound like a really obviously dumb thing to say if you're in the business of being a shepherd or in any way look after sheep, because you think, well, of course, we all know that. But he was explaining how, and I didn't know this, so it's new to me. He said that in the Middle East, a shepherd had to sometimes go to a moving stream, dig a kind of a track from that stream and create, if you like, a false lake where the water would run in and then just circle and stay there and not be moving. And only then would the sheep drink. It has a kind of an anxiety about drinking near moving water. So in certain places, that's what they do, create these channels which then would become still water. And then the sheep would slay his thirst, if you like. The shepherd understands that the sheep, of course, needs that kind of stillness. And so he will inconvenience himself. I hope you're getting the picture here that at every level, it's the initiative of the shepherd, it's the initiative that he's taking to provide for the sheep the best possible environment for them to be at peace and to grow. And just as he did, looking for the green pastures and inconvenience himself on that level, so again, the shepherd here is inconveniencing himself in an attempt to provide water conducive to the drinking habit of the sheep. God knows how you are nourished. He knows how I am replenished. He knows what ways we regain our strength. And everybody's different, aren't they? What do you do to refocus, to realign yourself? What do you do to take a breather, to find strength and relaxation? Now, different things are different for everybody. Some people, they exercise. They say that's what replenishes me. Some people sit with a good book. Some just chill out watching telly. Some like to lie in the sun, whatever it is. But the interesting thing is this. If we were all forced to do the same thing, yes, we could be being told that we are given time to replenish, but because it's not conducive to the way we normally do replenish ourselves, it doesn't quite feel like being replenished, does it? My wife isn't a great one for running. If I said to her, I know a good way to replenish yourself, just come on a jog, that would be a torture for her. And it then doesn't become something that replenishes, it becomes something that adds to the anxiety at a different level. Now, this is the interesting thing. When the shepherd carves out still water, he's doing it because he knows that what is conducive to that sheep is drinking in that way. He could force that sheep to try and drink from running water, but he doesn't. He's here to benefit the sheep. He's here to maneuver things so that they will be nourished and grow. That's a fabulous picture of what God does. He adapts means as a way of reviving and refreshing us and restoring us. He goes to great lengths, in other words. He places a high value on my health, my vitality, on my growth. And because of that, he will take the initiative and at times, and many often actually, inconvenience himself so that I will be fed, watered, nourished. He leads me beside still waters and green pastures. We have a God who is highly caring for us. It's a fabulous picture David built of being nourished and blessed by a God who is always being creative in finding us places to rest and be replenished, and to do it in such a way that's conducive to the way we are and the way we tick. God knows how you and I are as people. And every time he works in my life, in your life, it's custom-made working. He does it in such a way that is kind of consistent with the way you function as a person. So you don't have to hope that you can tell God, this is how I actually relax, God. Or I hope that, whatever you're doing for me is kind of the way I am. But actually, God is way ahead of me and you. He's way ahead of us and already has a way of nurturing because he knows us through and through. So take this verse, have another read through it. And I'm sure as you do, God will continue just to comfort and challenge you. In Jesus' name, amen.